Cloud. Okay. All right. So
Thank
let's
you.
mute
Hey,
everyone. Unmute Julie and Brian. Unmute Carol Lee. And let's welcome our guests today, our Heffernan historians, Julie and Brian.
Hello, everybody. We are going to have a chance to talk at the end, but I do want to say, and Karen and I were just talking about this, that when we met last week, while we were on the TV, while we were on Zoom talking about the peaceful transfer of power, things were happening at the Capitol that really challenged that. And we're going to get back to that and talking about this. But now today we're talking and meeting while an impeachment is going on. So it's really quite a time to be talking about presidents. And last week, if you remember, we talked about John Adams. And so this week we're talking about the second president who was born in Massachusetts. There are 4 who were born in Massachusetts. And the first was John Adams. And the second one, the one we're talking about today, is John Quincy Adams.
His son.
His son, right. Brian gave away the punchline there, his son. So Karen, can you start the PowerPoint, please?
Sure.
But Brian, while she's starting this up, I want to say Brian did give away the punchline. They are a father-son team. And in all the presidents, and as you know, we're going on to president number 46 now. So in 46 presidents, there's only been one other father-son president team. The father was a president, and then a little later, the son was a president. Does anybody know? In the chat box, can you say who's the other president, father-son president team? Does anybody know? Oh, Dan O'Donnell knows. I see Dan's chat. Yes, the 2 Bushes, George Bush and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. Absolutely, you're right.
I was only little during his presidency.
Yeah. But Karen is going to start us now. John Quincy Adams, and it's funny. We talked about him just a little bit last week when we talked about his father. Karen's finding my email. I forgot. I said that I sent her an email saying that I sent the PowerPoint, but I actually forgot to send it.
I had it up and then it disappeared. So let me try it again.
Well, I mean, how about me thinking that I sent it and I really didn't?
Oh,
it's just that kind of week.
I do that all the time. Okay, so here we go. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can. Mine is a little fuzzy, but why is that? Okay, there it is.
There it is.
Okay. So here are 3 pictures of John Quincy Adams. And when we go back to the gallery, you'll see that there's a picture behind Brian Given. He says that it's his favorite president. So we'll ask him some questions later on too. But I said we're going on to president number 46 now. Brian, what number president was John Quincy Adams?
The 6th.
He was number 6. And as you remember from last week, his father was number 2. So they were early presidents in the United States. And John Quincy Adams was born July 11th, 1767, which means he was born when this was still a colony. We weren't the United States yet. We were still colonies. So John Quincy Adams was born in the colony of Massachusetts. And we're going to go on and talk, but he's interesting. Brian and I studied him this week, and we were fascinated by just how many positions he's had in government. He wasn't just president. He did so much more. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so we're ready for the next slide. So these are pictures you saw last week. If you look at that top picture in the middle, you see 2 houses. You see sort of a yellowish house, and then you see a light gray house. And last week we showed you these pictures because John Adams was born in the yellowish house, but his son, John Quincy Adams, was born in the gray house, which is right next door. And as we said to you last week, when these men were born, this town was called Braintree. But then in 1792, they changed the name of this part of Braintree. They changed it to Quincy. And by the way, they renamed it after a man named Colonel John Quincy, who is Abigail Adams' grandfather. And in fact, this man that it was named after, Colonel John Quincy, was John Quincy Adams' great-grandfather. It's where his middle name comes from. So, and now we said this last week, but when we talk about these houses here, when they lived here, it was just big property all around them. They had their farm and the trees, and so there weren't city streets. And as we also said last week, when John Adams was off in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress, later when he went to Europe, Abigail Adams was here in these houses by herself with her children, running the farm and raising her kids. And we said to you last week, this is the first time we mentioned John Quincy Adams, while his father was away in Philadelphia and the British were in Boston and fighting with the colonists, Abigail and her son, John Quincy, walked up to the top of a hill near their house, and they looked out over the water and they could see the explosions of the Battle of Bunker Hill from where they were. So he's involved in that story too. He was just a little guy, but he had a very strong memory of watching the Battle of Bunker Hill explode with his mother. All right, Brian, am I forgetting anything?
No, you can go, Cameron.
You can go, Karen, please. Okay, so this is another story that we talked about a little last week. And Brian and I we copied these pictures from a book that he had when he was young that we really love. And think about this story. So John Adams, the father, was in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. And then he had to go back for the Second Continental Congress when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. And that took a really long time. And then after that, we were at war with Britain. It was an official revolutionary war. And during that time, the members of the Continental Congress said to John Adams, the father, listen, we think you should go over to England. We think you should go over to France, and we need you to talk them into sending us some troops. We need you to talk them into supporting us. And, we also need you to talk them into giving us some money. We need some money to fight this war. So John Adams was going to go across the sea to France. The only way to get there was in a boat. And Abigail was going to be left at the farm again with their 4 kids. So this time the father said, John Adams, the father said, you know what? I'll take John Quincy Adams with me. So John Quincy Adams was only 10 years old, and his father took him on this boat across the ocean to France with him. And I'm just going to read this paragraph from the book. So this was February 13th, 1778, was a freezing day of terrible goodbyes for the Adams family. John and his 10-year-old son set off on the frigate, the boat that would take them across the sea if they didn't sink. They almost did. And if they weren't attacked by a British ship, they were. And if John Adams, revolutionary, wasn't taken prisoner, he wasn't. John did his share of fighting when they were attacked by the British ship, but mostly the voyage was sea, clouds, and sky, and food for their 6-week voyage. So it took them 6 weeks to get across the ocean. For their 6-week voyage, Abigail packed them a lunch that included 6 chickens, 2 sheep, a barrel of apples, 5 bushels of corn, tea, chocolate, 14 dozen eggs, so that's 14 times 12, 72 kegs of cider, and 2 bottles of mustard. Father and son ate, and they studied French. And that's the part that I think is so, that I just get a kick out of that. In this choppy boat going over a sea, sometimes fighting with British, sometimes, worried about a ship sinking, they were studying French. He was teaching his son French, and they were really studying French lessons very diligently because they wanted to be well prepared when they landed in France. So
Next slide.
next slide, please. Okay, so now the other part of that is little John Adams was so far away from his mom. He was, and so I don't know if you can see it, but this lower blue arrow, I was trying to get a better color, but I couldn't. But the lower blue arrow here points to Paris, France. And so that's where they landed. They landed in Paris, France, and they were there for many years. I believe little John Adams was away from his mother for 8 years. Imagine being a little guy and not seeing your mom for 8 years. But here's something that's even more amazing. He was a really smart little guy. He was very good with languages. As I said, he had studied French with his dad. He had also studied Latin. He'd also studied Greek. They called him a linguist. He was so good with languages. He was a linguist. And so when he was only 14 years old, his father sent him with a young politician, a guy named Francis Dana, who, if you look at the top blue arrow, was going to be a diplomat to St. Petersburg, Russia, the American diplomat. And so 14-year-old John Adams, little John Quincy Adams, went all the way up there to that top arrow with kind of probably pretty much a man he didn't know too well. And they were up there for 2 years. So now he's away from his mother in the colony of Massachusetts, and he's away from his father, who's in Paris, and he's all the way up here in this very cold and foreign place of St. Petersburg. But he was the secretary. He took the notes for Francis Dana, and he also did the translating, because there was a lot of French spoken up there, and he translated even as a 14-year-old boy. So I just think that's an amazing story. Okay, you can go. Thanks, Karen. Okay, now this, it's hard to see, and I'll just go through this quickly, but I said that John Quincy Adams in his life had a lot of jobs. So we talked about this top one when he was 14 years old. Then when he, 8 years, when he was late teenager, he came back to the United States to get a college education. But he was so academically advanced that he graduated from Harvard in 2 years. Most of the time it took people 4 years to graduate, but he graduated in 2 years, and he also graduated number 2 in his class. He had the second best grades in all the class, and he became a lawyer. And I think we told you when we talked about John Adams, the way you became a lawyer is you found somebody who was already a lawyer, and they helped you, they told you what to read, they prepared you. And so he studied with a man up in Newburyport, Massachusetts. But when he passed the bar, when he became a lawyer, he came back to Boston and he opened his own legal practice. So like that, like his father. Okay, but this is where it changes. He didn't really love being a lawyer. And after a couple of years, he was asked to be an ambassador to the Netherlands because he had such good language skills. He knew languages, but he also was familiar with Europe. And this is interesting. The person who asked him to be the ambassador was President George Washington. Then a couple of years later, George Washington asked him to be the ambassador to Portugal. And then his own father was elected president, and his dad asked him to be the ambassador to Prussia. And so after those 3 appointments, he came back to the United States and started practicing law again. But then, and this is different from now, he was appointed senator from Massachusetts. So nowadays we elect our senators, but in those days he was elected senator from Massachusetts. And while he was the senator from Massachusetts, he also taught a couple of courses. He taught one at Brown University, and he taught one at Harvard University. He taught about logic, how to make a sound argument, and he taught how to be a good speech maker, rhetoric and oratory. So that he did that as well. After that, he went back to being a lawyer again. And now, Karen, I can't see this one. He was appointed by President James Madison. I can't quite see I can't remember where James Madison appointed him.
It's that block over it.
Oh, there it is. Okay, so James Madison sent him as a minister over to Russia. And as we remember, he spent a lot of time in Russia as a young boy. And then, now this is interesting. Then he was nominated to be a Supreme Court justice, an associate Supreme Court justice, but he turned it down. He said, no, that doesn't appeal to me. I like doing this ambassador stuff that I'm doing. So he turned it down. And then the next president, President Madison, asked him to be an ambassador to Britain. So he was an ambassador going over to all these different countries and representing the United States. And he had been sent over there by so many different presidents. But then here's the big job. When he came back, he was appointed to be Secretary of State, which means he was the head person who represented the United States in talking to other nations. And that one, he was appointed by President James Monroe, another president who thought so much of him. And he was Secretary of State for, James Monroe was president for 2 terms, so 8 years. And John Quincy Adams was his secretary the whole time. And people say that he was really probably one of the best Secretary of States that the United States has ever had. He just had so much background and so much knowledge, and they said he did a really good job. But then after that, in those days, lots of times after you had been Secretary of State, you were a likely person to become president next. So after his time as Secretary of State was done, he did run for president in 1824. And this sounds like politics today. It was a really ugly, mean, nasty campaign. And there were 4 people who were running, John Adams, General Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and a man named William Crawford. And because there were so many people running, nobody won the electoral college vote, right? That sounds like what we're going through today when we talk about all the electoral college and how closely we watched it. But because nobody had enough electoral college votes, they asked the House of Representatives to pick who should be the next president. And then there was a really ugly debate in the House of Representatives as they fought over who it should be. And in the end, there was, some people think it was a shady deal. They called it the corrupt bargain. And John Adams supposedly said to one of the other candidates, Henry Clay, if you support me for president, I promise you I'll make you Secretary of State. And that's what happened. And so some people say, no, it was all fair, but other people say, oh, that's kind of sketchy. And so for his 4 years in office, it wasn't great. It was, he had, some people were really upset, including his wife. His wife didn't like what he did. They didn't like the way it came about. And one of the guys he beat, General Andrew Jackson, was so mad. He said, I'm going to spend the next 4 years campaigning to beat you. I'm not going to let you win again. I'm going to beat you next time. And he did. So 4 years later, Andrew Jackson won, and John Quincy Adams was out of the White House after only 1 term. And then we'll get to this next one later. But after that experience, and it was kind of hard, and in Washington, D.C., he said, that's it. I'm retiring. I'm done. I'm done with politics. I'm just going to go back up to Quincy. It was called Quincy by this point. And I'm just going to retire on our family farm. I'm done. So, all right, we're ready to go. Karen, I keep getting this big gray block. Do you get that too? Oh, there, it's gone. Okay. Oops, it's back now. I don't know why.
I don't know what that is. I see it.
It's me. I'm sorry. I'm trying to unmute and mute myself because I can't see the screen. And when I do that, it makes this block, but it's because my family's being really noisy and I didn't want you to hear it. Of course, now we've got 2 dogs and my daughter, so I will try to keep them quiet.
That's okay.
Sorry about that.
No, that's
Put this
fine.
away. Huh?
So this is kind of where I want to talk a little bit, and maybe after Brian and I talk about the slide, we can open it
Okay,
up.
hold on a second. Hold on a second. We need Tara to be muted. Carolee, I
I'm
need
not a
to make
co-host.
you a co-host. There we go. There we go. Now you can take care of it. Thank you.
Okay, is that, do I need to do anything, Karen?
Nope, you're good.
Karen, I'll help out too.
Oh, hi, Mark. I didn't know you were there.
Okay, so here's the slide that we want to talk about. So we talked about last week, we talked about John Adams and all those his men in the down in Philadelphia making up the laws. Well, actually, when they made the laws of the land, the Constitution, John Adams wasn't part of that. He was over in Europe. But when Ben Franklin and the others made the law of the land, they called it the Constitution. And this is how our government is set up. It's got what they call 3 branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And the reason they made up a government with 3 branches is that these branches keep a watch on each other so that nobody can get too powerful. You can always keep the others in line. And if the president does something a little outrageous, then the Congress can vote on him, or they can go to court and the judges can vote on it. So that they call it the checks and balances. So that's how we keep everybody honest. We have these checks and balances in the government. But what Brian and I want to show you right here is that John Quincy Adams was the only person that we know of who pretty much had an in to all of these. If you look at that first column, the legislative, as we told you, that's Congress, and there are two parts of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And as we told you, John Quincy Adams was in the Senate in Massachusetts, and we're going to get to it, but later in his career, he was in the House of Representatives. So he was definitely in the legislative branch. And then we told you that he was president. So he was in the executive branch. But if you look down at the bottom, the cabinet, those are the president's advisors. Well, he was Secretary of State for 8 years. So he was in the cabinet too. So he was in that. And then you get over to the judicial, which are the judges in the Supreme Court. And although John Quincy Adams was never in the judicial branch, as we told you, he was invited to be. They asked him to be an associate Supreme Court justice, and he said, no, I don't really want to do that. But I mean, he's all over this. He's just in so many of these. But this is, when we'll talk at the end, but this is what's interesting right now with what's going on in our government is, as you know, the president is in the executive branch, but right now, the blue branch, the legislative branch, is voting and talking about right now and discussing if some of the things that the president has done lately are okay. And that's a good example of the different branches of each other, of the government, holding each other accountable, saying you can't do whatever you want. You know, we have to talk about it and vote on it and see what these other branches of the government think about it. So that's called checks and balances. We keep each other balanced and we keep each other checked, and that's just the way our country was set up. So
Bye, Trump.
but right, okay. Next one, please. Okay, and we didn't really talk about his wife, but his wife's name was Louisa Catherine Johnson, and then after she married Adams, and she was born in 1775. They were married all the way till 1848. But here's what's so interesting about her, lots of things. But John Quincy Adams, remember we told you he spent a lot of time in Europe? So it's not surprising that he met his wife while he was in Europe. His wife was born in England. His wife was born in London. And she had an English mother. She did have an American father, but she was born in England, and then she went to school in France. She learned to speak French beautifully. So she was very European. And she was the first lady who had not been born in the United States or the colonies. And now we're going on to number 46 for the president. And there has only been one other first lady who was not born in the United States. And can somebody chat in? I bet some of you know who this other one is. Who's the other first lady who has not been born in the United States?
Melania Trump.
Melania.
Yeah, who had that? You're right. You're right, Melania Trump. And I'm trying to look up Melania Trump. I'm trying to remember where she was born. Brian will tell us in a minute. But anyway, we think that Louisa Catherine Johnson, she may have met John Quincy Adams when they were very young children. Remember, he was over in France for a while with his dad. So it's possible that she met him when she was just 4 years old and he was about 12, because he was 8 years older than she was. All right, Brian is telling me that Melania Trump was born in Slovenia. So
I know that.
so born in Slovenia. So anyway, but then they met again. They met again when she was 19 and John Quincy Adams was 27. And they dated for, 2 or 3 years before they got married. His parents had strong opinions and would write to them and say, oh, we don't know, how we feel about you marrying someone who's not born in America. But he was determined that he was going to marry her. But also, he really grilled her in their letters, supposedly, while they were dating. He wanted to make sure she was just exactly the right kind of wife for somebody who wanted a career in politics. So that was interesting. And with all those appointments that we told you about, all the different places and countries that he went and that he served, she went with him. And, their children were supposed to go with them. She'd take their kids with them. And one that was tricky was when he was in Russia, when he was the minister to Russia. And they went up there and she had her 3 little boys. And the winters were really, really cold, and they didn't have a whole lot of money for entertaining. She had some problems with depression up there, but she was a favorite of the Tsar, who was the leader of the country. And she did a nice job at when they would go to political events, but that was a hard time for her. And then what made her happy while they were there, she finally had a daughter. Her fourth child was a daughter, and they named her right after her. They named the daughter Louisa Catherine, just like her mom. But she only lived a year. So that was a real sadness for her that she was dealing with when she was up there. She lost her precious little girl when she was just 1 year old. And then John Quincy got called back to Europe. He got called back to London. He got called back. They wanted him to go to this town in Belgium to help write the treaty that ended the War of 1812. And he left his wife and their boys up in Russia. And so then,
Two of the three, though.
what?
Two of the three.
Was it 2 of the 3?
Yeah.
Oh, we'll get to that. Brian's telling me another story, which is true. She was separated from her boys, but we'll get to that in a minute. But she had to come, John Quincy said, come back to Europe. I need you back in Europe now. So she took this crazy trip, 40 days by like a coach pulled by horses, and also sometimes a sled pulled by horses. And it carried her. Karen, can you go back to the picture, the map? That sled and the horses carried her all the way. Oh, keep going back till we get to the map. There it is. So starting at that top blue arrow, she came down by horse and carriage and sled all the way. It took her 40 days, and it was really rough going. And there was a war going on. And so lots of times they were driving through bodies on sides of the road. And at one point, her carriage got stopped. We were reading this story yesterday. Her carriage got stopped, and it looked like they weren't going to let her go through. And so she got out of the carriage and pretended that she was Napoleon's sister. And apparently, she grew up in French schools and she spoke French beautifully. So she convinced them and they let her go on. So that seems like she wrote a book about it. Later in her life, she wrote a book about it because it was such a scary experience with little kids, I think. At least one of her kids was with her for that. So we can go back to the slide about her again. There we go. And anyway, and we'll come, we'll come talk about her a little bit more, but she was with, John Quincy Adams through all of his appointments, including when he was Secretary of State for 8 years. And they lived in Washington, D.C. at the time, and she loved that. She had not come over to the United States until she was an adult. And she was fine in Quincy, but she didn't love it. She didn't really love the farm life, and it seemed a little small for her after Europe. But when they got to DC, she loved it. And she was sort of famous for throwing parties with all the statespeople, the politicians, and they would have music. She played the harp, as you see in that picture. They would have little theatrical things. And then even when she was president's wife, she was known for entertaining, and she really was a good diplomat, politician's wife. She was charming and gracious and all of those things.
And one of them was Lafayette's grand tour.
Oh yeah, Brian wants me to tell you that when Lafayette came back in 1824 to see America all those years after the Revolution, he came over for a party at her house. And of course they chattered away in French. So Brian loves that story.
Big up, Brian.
But after her husband died, which we'll talk about soon, she went back to DC. It's where she felt the happiest. And she went back to DC. And when she died, a few years after her husband, both parts of Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, adjourned for the day. And she was the first woman to ever be sort of honored that way by both houses of Congress. So they really did appreciate her and mourn her after she died. All right, we can go forward. All right, Brian, I'm taking a sip. Do you want to talk about their kids, or do you want me to? Okay. Here are their children. And you see up at the top, we made a list: George, John, Charles. We'll talk about them. And there's the daughter that I told you was born in Russia, and she only lived a year. Now they had these 3 sons. These are their 3 oldest children, were the boys. And this is so funny. The first one, obviously, George Washington was a very important figure in our history. So their first son was named George Washington Adams, and he grew up to become a lawyer. And then their second son was named John Adams II, named after his father and his grandfather. And then their third son was named Charles Francis Adams. And this is kind of interesting because Brian and I could only find young pictures of the first two children. And that's because those two guys died when they were young. They died in their 20s. One died in his 20s and one died in his early 30s. And we don't know the whole story, but I think they had a rough time. I think they
Troubled.
troubled. Brian says they were troubled. I think it was hard to be the sons of such famous people from such a famous family. And so this first one, George Washington Adams, he was an alcoholic. And he eventually, he jumped off a bridge and killed himself. He was not happy. And then when that happened to him, his brother John missed him so much and was so lost without him that he started drinking heavily. And then he also became an alcoholic and had a troubled life. So he died at age 31. But the other brother, Charles Francis Adams, as you see, he grew up to be 79. He lived to be an old man, and he was very successful as a diplomat like his father, public official, and also as an author. But there's another story about these three brothers that Brian thinks is really funny.
They all fell in love with a cousin of their wife's family.
They all fell in love with the same woman. She was a cousin, and the brother who ultimately married her was John, the middle one. But apparently they were all in love with the same woman. So Brian thinks that's pretty funny. Okay, we can go on.
And wasn't one of John Adams's kids an alcoholic too?
Mm-hmm.
Must
Couple
see,
of
it
them,
does run in
actually.
the family.
Yeah,
Thomas and Charles.
Brian saying Thomas and Charles, son of John and Abigail, they both struggled with alcoholism. And when you read the stories about them, it sounds similar. It was really hard to be the child of very famous parents when you had all these expectations put upon you and they didn't choose to deal with it in the right way. But you're right, those stories sound very similar. So here's a funny thing. So here's these older pictures of John Quincy Adams. So we told you when he was a president, he was only a one-term president. It wasn't a great time. So after that, he said, that's it. I'm retiring. I'm going back to Quincy, Mass. I'm going to live on the farm. And so they moved back to Quincy. And 2 years later, he was elected to the House of Representatives. So think about that.
For the Plymouth County.
For Plymouth County, as Brian said. But think about that. He'd already been president, which in some ways is the highest office you can have in the land, right? But even after he did that, he loved government so much. And so he went back to be a member of the House of Representatives. And he was a member of the House of Representatives for 17 years. It was his longest time anywhere. He loved it. They called him Old Man Eloquent, and eloquent means he was very well spoken. They called him Father of the House. And if you look at the years, he was there in the mid 1800s, early to mid 1800s. And two of the big issues that he fought for so hard in the House of Representatives is he really was against slavery. And he would bring that up again and again and again. And he also was very interested in the way that Native Americans were being treated. And those two issues, I mean, we still talk about them, but they weren't popular issues back then. But they were very important to him. And so some of his most famous speeches and some of the political things he's remembered best for had to do with the stands he took against slavery. So, okay, are we ready to move on?
Mhm.
Okay, Bryce says we're ready to move on. So this is interesting too. So he was in the House of Representatives for the rest of his life. And I looked it up just so I could be sure about this. But those of you who've been watching the news this week and you see the Capitol building and the big dome and the rotunda, the big round room, and then you also see on the news, you see the room that the House members are voting in. Those are the same ones that were there when John Quincy Adams was there. The United States Capitol was built in 1800. And as Karen pointed out at the beginning, it was burned by the British when they were fighting in 1812, but they rebuilt it. So when we say he was in the Capitol, you can picture exactly where he was. He was in those places that you see pictured on the news this week. And in fact, they were in the middle of a discussion in the House. They were in the middle of the debate. Brian says it was a debate in the House. about the Mexican War. They were having a big argument about that. And he stood up to make his point. This was in February 21st, 1848. And he stood up to make his point, and he had a massive stroke. And he just collapsed on the right there in the middle of the House of Representatives. He collapsed, and lots of people rushed over to him, and they picked him up. They used the couch that was there, and they put him on the couch, and they carried him out to the rotunda, that big round room that you keep seeing on the news. And then after he was in the rotunda a little bit, they said, oh, it's too cold for him here. So they moved the couch with John Quincy Adams on it. They moved it into the Speaker's office, the Speaker of the House's office. And he fell into a coma, and he died there 2 days later. So he actually died, he had the stroke at the House of Representatives, and he actually died right there at the House of Representatives. So, and then this, you can't really see it well, but this on the right, that picture, the white cloth with the circular picture, the oval picture of him, those were ribbons. They sold those ribbons, or they gave those ribbons out, and the whole nation just really mourned him. They really missed him. He had been such a contributor in the House of Representatives. And there's the picture, of course, of him being carried by the other legislators, being carried into the Speaker's room.
Yeah, they probably were the ones that saw him die too.
Yeah, Brian thinks these are the very men who saw him die and carried him out. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
So
dear.
but then after that, after he was there for, a few days, they put his body on a train, and he was in a coffin. He actually was in a coffin made of glass so that you could see him, so that people could see them to kind of pay their last respects. But anyway, and he was carried back up to Massachusetts. And now we are going to turn this over to Carol Lee, because Carol Lee is going to tell you where he was buried. The next slide, please. I think it's,
Oh,
there we
you
go.
got pictures. Oh, good. Because
There
I
are
didn't know.
two slides, Carol Lee. There's these, and then we made the next slide has the indoor pictures.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is the United First Parish Church in Quincy. It was built in 1828. I have a couple different conflicting dates, but what happened was that John Adams and Abigail were buried in Hancock Cemetery, which you see there on the slide. And also John Quincy Adams was eventually buried there too. But before John Quincy died, right after his dad died, he asked that he be interred in the church. So they built a tomb room in the church in the basement. And there are both John Adams.
Hold on a second. Karen, can you advance the slide, please? I'm sorry, Carol Lee.
That's okay. And there are, after John died, John Adams and Abigail died, John Quincy asked that they be moved to a tomb in the bottom of the church. And then after John Quincy Adams died and his wife Louisa died, they were originally in the Hancock Cemetery, which you saw in the last picture, but then their son, Charles Francis, asked that they also be moved to the basement of the church, so that all four of them, John Adams and John Quincy and Abigail and Louisa, are all down in the basement of that church. And when I was young, my mother worked there, and we would, the church I went to was actually in Braintree. I grew up in Braintree, and we would go to Quincy, and the youth group would all hang out in the church and kind of play hide and seek. And we often would find ourselves hiding down behind John and Abigail. We used to say, going to see Abigail. But when I was a kid, though, it looks very nice now. They've painted the walls white and they put in that special lighting. So it looks very nice. But when I was a kid, it was dark and it was gray and it was a little spooky. But
You're awfully brave, Carolee.
well, we had, we were a team. We had each other. But the church is built from the granite from the Adams quarry. Adams, and actually the land, as I read, the land came from John Adams. So he put a lot into building this building before he died. I don't think it was finished, it seems, till after he died. But the the stone and the granite that of their crypts were also from the quarry of his family. So that was special to John Adams that happened, and then his son, for him and his mother. But my mother does have a story. I asked my mother if she had any stories, and she said that one that she remembered very fondly was that they would have meetings during the day. Sometimes they'd have meetings about that religious education was part of what she was involved with. So they would be a group of them having meetings, and they'd have coffee or tea or whatever. And this was a very old church built in 1828. So every once in a while, she said, the kitchen door would kind of swing open and swing closed. And whenever that happened, they would put out a teacup for Abigail.
Oh, how funny.
Sometimes they felt that Abigail was there with them.
That is so cool.
That's a great story. How about a show of hands? I would never have gone in there. I wouldn't have gone any close. I had such an overactive imagination when I was little. But put your hand up if you would have gone in there on a hunt with the youth group and with the kids with Carol Lee. Would you have been the one to go in there, or would you have stayed away?
Joseph would have gone in. Tara would have gone in.
I have to go to gallery view now. How many? Oh, I can't see them all. How many people say they would go
Let's
in?
see, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Pretty good.
I would.
Wow.
I would.
I would not have been one of them.
Kimberly,
Me
you
neither.
said Charles Francis is also buried though?
No, Francis is not. It's just the 4, just John and John Quincy and their wives.
But I think, did you say
Really?
Charles Francis requested that his parents be moved
Right.
to the church?
When-
Yeah, that's what you
When
meant.
John Adams died, John Quincy requested they be put down there. And then when John Quincy died, Charles Francis requested that John Quincy and Louisa be down there.
Yeah, and
Early.
the order that they died in, so Abigail died first. So of course, Abigail would just be buried in the cemetery. I mean, she was
Okay.
well known, but she wasn't a president or anything.
Right.
And then John Adams died second. And
And
then
he
John
was-
Quincy Adams died
Right.
third, and then Louisa died fourth.
And they all were in the cemetery at one point, but as soon as the second of the 2 died, then they were interred in the church.
I see.
Barely.
Also, I found out in reading a little bit is that John Hancock was also a member of that church, as was his father, a minister in that church.
Oh, wow.
Barely.
Yeah, yes.
It's me, it's an us.
Excellent.
I wanted to say that that I just forgot. Sorry.
That's okay. It's okay. You'll think of it.
We also have one with slide.
I had something, Carolee.
Are we taking questions? Yeah. Okay, Brian.
Like when I was in high school, I used to hike the Freedom Trail and I visited that place.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that would be, it's right there in Quincy Center.
Yeah, I've been there and I've been in the house.
Yeah.
I see Joseph, it's hand up, but I want to just say we have one more slide. So Joseph, do you want to ask your question about this, or do you want to wait till we're all done? Oh, he's muted.
Can you unmute, Joseph?
Wait until we are done.
Wait.
Oh, okay,
Great.
okay. So with Brian and I was telling Karen, Brian and I have such fun making these presentations. We read our books and we talk about what's important, and then we find slides that go with them. But if we go to the next slide, this is what Brian said to me when we were done. He said, Mom, there's so many similarities between John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams. So this is the list Brian made. So I'm going to let Brian read his list to you.
Nice.
They were both
Slow
born.
down, do them slowly
I
so
will,
people
Mom.
can hear.
They were both born in Braintree, Quincy, in houses next to each other, which you've talked about. They both graduated from Harvard. They both wrote a lot, papers, articles, and diary. They both became lawyers. They both married younger women. They both spent many years away from their wives and children. Some of their children had difficulties as young adults. which was talked about. They both had bitter rivals in tough presidential campaigns and close elections. And they were both one-term presidents, unpopular and disliked at it as well.
So there we go. That's Brian. Those were the similarities Brian noticed
Very
between
good,
them.
Brian.
So, okay, so I guess we can go back to the gallery view, Karen, and see if anybody has questions.
Actually,
What, honey?
I have a question to Brian, because as Mom talked about briefly, why is John Quincy your favorite president?
Oh, good question.
Which Brian does too?
You.
You.
Brian, where's Brian given? He has a picture of John Quincy Adams above his shoulder, so we noticed that.
So
Because
why is he
I
your favorite president?
because I like him. Because I saw the house when I was in the town with my high school, and I said, "Wow, I might as well bring it up to history class."
Nice.
Cool. Okay.
Brian, you can call on people.
Oh, let's go to Joseph, because he said he had a question.
Okay, Joseph, yeah.
Good idea, Joseph.
Joseph, you still have your question for us if somebody unmutes you?
You can unmute, Joseph. There you go.
So how did John Adams become president?
This John Adams, John Quincy Adams?
Yeah.
His father, I think.
Well, they both ran for president. John Adams, the father, ran against Thomas Jefferson, and it was a rough election. And then many years later, his son ran against 3 different men, and it was a rough election. But they were elections, and and they really had to consult the House of Representatives. It was so close, and nobody had a lot of electoral college votes, so they had to consult the House of Representatives to kind of make the final decision. But that's a good question.
Okay.
Dan.
So it was really, by the way, Brian, I would have joined you to go in there to join Quincy and John. And my grandmother lives in Quincy, Karen. Just so you know, just a fun fact.
Cool.
Nice.
Nice. Joking. No.
Yeah. First of all, I want to make a comment for John Adams, really. It's weird. His age is my age right now, 27.
Oh, cool.
Huh.
So, but he was dating a 19-year-old woman when he was 27. Are you dating a 19-year-old woman?
Yeah, I actually was chatting the box, really, the chat box. That I was telling BF that he's my main man, my brother.
Oh my gosh.
And my question really is, it's weird. I'm not sure if I think some of the people today, this lesson, had a tour of the catacombs, but I did. It was really, really cool.
So you've been down there?
Yes.
Wow. I didn't, to be honest, I didn't even know they were there. I thought they were buried in a graveyard. So this is all new to me.
Yeah, so the catacombs were really nice. Abigail died first, which I know, and then John Quincy and Louisiana. So I knew that. I know that because I took a bunch of courses at New Nora.
Cool.
Ned.
Yeah, so I'm kind of confused because why would John Quincy during the war of the Revolution, why would John Quincy marry a British woman?
Oh, good question.
That's actually kind of funny, Ben, because if we're all fans of Hamilton, is that his arch enemy, Aaron Burr, also married a British officer's wife.
Wow. So what a good question. I'm going to see, Ben, I have to look it up. He married Louisa in 1797. So that's really only 16 years after the war ended, because the war technically ended in 1781. So in 16 years later, I don't know. I mean, America and England were trying to be friends, but I think some people would have had some some hard feelings still. And remember, I told you his parents weren't too happy that he wanted to marry somebody born in England. But the other part, Ben, now that I think about it, is she was only half English. Remember, her mom was English, but her dad was American.
And also, her uncle served with John Adams in the Revolutionary
Oh, I
War.
forgot that. And then I think her uncle went on to be governor of Maryland or something. So she did
Well,
have ties to the
My
United
point is that, you know, John Quincy, he's a part of the colonist. He was the big guy that, he was big guy that was on the colonist side, and then he went ahead and married a British woman from the
Well,
The heart knows what it wants. You can't help it.
But the British lost, so both married.
Yeah. Good question.
Well, would you marry a Yankee fan?
Oh, hell no.
Oh,
I would.
my husband did. You know, people
Whoa.
change.
My-
How about,
Thanks, Karen.
Who else?
Ned, do you have a question?
It's like the Red Sox and the Yankees. You know, we've got a colonist and a British.
No, Mom, we can see when you speak.
Hi, Ned.
But you don't know who to call on.
Hey, and by the way, I will say this: love. No one controls love. No one controls love.
No one controls love.
Right.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Ned. That's
Thanks, Ned.
wise. All right, we're just wondering, are there any other questions? We're just Brian's looking to see.
Adam.
Hey, I know that, I know that, Mr. John Quincy Adams, that I know that he just wrote a very, very cool famous book that I know that some of your famous authors who wrote lots of books for the past, and I know that he's in bunch of the other movies.
And the Adams, Brian was telling you that both the father and John Quincy Adams loved to write. John Quincy Adams started a diary when he was about 10 years old, and he kept it every day of his life for the rest of his life. And then his son, Charles Francis, you saw, became an author. And then I think it's his grandson, Henry, who's a very famous author. So they really did like to write in that family. Yeah.
I got another one.
Let's see who else.
That's Dan who said that.
All right, see if you've called on everybody, Brian.
yeah, Dan, let's go to Christopher maybe.
We can save your question for later. Yes, Chris?
I've seen the Adams thing on TV, and the subtitles that they were all talking about Boston. They were all talking about Boston. Each of the when I was watching something on the Adams back in 1976.
Yeah, they lived in Braintree, which was just south of Boston. But the father, when he was a lawyer, he had a law office in Boston. And then John Quincy Adams, when he was a lawyer, he had a law office in Boston. And then when John Quincy Adams brought Louisa back from England, at first they went to the farm, but she thought it was a little sleepy on the farm. So they lived in Boston for a while. So they definitely spent a lot of time in Boston, and it's the city they are most closely associated with, I would say.
Yeah. Patty.
I have a question. How long did they live there for?
Where, in Boston?
No, in Quincy.
That's a good question, because you remember his father and mother, John Adams and Abigail Adams, were born in Braintree, and that was always their home base. And he would go away and do different things in Philadelphia or in New York City or in Europe, and then he'd come back. So he was gone for long stretches. And then when they had children, John Quincy, as we said, went over to France with his dad when he was just 10, and he was in Europe for 8 years. but then he came back to Quincy and that was kind of home base. And then he spent a lot of time in Washington, but he would come back to Quincy.
I don't mind going down there to see that because I'm not afraid.
Barely.
Do you remember your question?
Me?
No, I'm talking to the Snarl Scan. Do you remember your question to Kaylee?
Yes, I do. My question was, thank you, Brian. My question was, when did the, hold on. When did, it's a kind of like a tricky question, but
What was his most famous act as president?
yeah, what was his favorite act as president?
Like, what was he most famous for?
Yeah, what,
president?
like what was he famous for?
What was his most famous thing he did as president?
Yes, that.
Well, he didn't have a lot of success, but one of the things that he did is he tried to make a lot of highways and canals, because back then they didn't have planes or trains yet. So he thought we needed a good system of highways and canals. He also wanted to try to make a national university because he thought education was important. And he wanted to build a big observatory. But because people were mad at him, they made it really hard for him to do those things. But those were the things that he wanted to do. But he's most famous for something when he was Secretary of State. He helped pass something called the Monroe Doctrine, which told European countries that they have to stop trying to come over here and make colonies. And he also got us Florida from Spain. And he also helped figure out how we would share Oregon with England. So those were things he did as Secretary of State. Okay. Sharon's had her hand up for a while. Honey.
Sharon.
Ignore that.
Answer the phone.
No,
Did anybody-
we'll wait till after. We'll call back the number when we're done.
Okay, Sharon.
Oh,
Here Brad, let me take it. I have to take it. You finish.
Okay.
I don't think that's your phone. I think
Sharon, can you unmute?
Here I am.
Okay. What's your question?
I have this book about history about same thing as the presidents, also occupied in 1785 with Nancy Drew in the staircase with lots of different secret passageways.
Oh, in the book Nancy Drew?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Is
that what you said?
Yep.
Oh.
I bet talking about the basement catacombs probably reminded you of that. I bet.
There's one way to put it was actually Brian's face right now. Adorable.
Most of the legislators had to hide in the basement of the U.S. Capitol.
Speaking of Quincy, I have a voucher for who lived there.
That's cool.
I know you like pets, though, but no offense. I know how you feel. I'm looking at you.
Thanks, Sharon.
Okay.
Ken, I'll see you tonight because it's 301. I'll see you tonight.
Oh, it's 301. Okay.
Okay.
That's the question.
Who's got the last question?
Keith.
Keith.
Hi.
We can only see the top of your head, Keith. What's up?
The 1935.
I'm sorry, what was your question?
1975 in Boston.
1775?
Yeah.
The father was involved in a lot of the things that went on in Boston in 1775. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But John Quincy Adams was only 8 years old at the time. And then he wasn't
years
alive
was
for
that?
1875.
That's a long years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But they told them why they didn't went in Boston? Why?
I don't know
Well,
the answer.
it was
to
a
that.
good place to live. Why not? They were from Quincy. It was a big city nearby. Why not? Right?
Yeah.
All right, guys. I think we need to wrap it up because people are saying they have to go and they have
Karen.
meetings
I have a
and stuff.
question for Brian.
Karen,
Yes, Ben?
That
Karen,
Hold on, Al.
the father, when he was with his son, that father really spent a lot of his time overseas and not so much time back at home with his family. So it was kind of hard for the family to adapt to him being overseas.
Yeah, I'm sure it was very hard. Yeah.
Like, but he ever come home during his stay? Like, any communication?
They wrote a lot of letters. They wrote a lot of letters, and every time he came home, he'd only be home for a little time before they'd get someplace else, get sent someplace else. So it was a hard way to live, I would think, moving around so much. And I don't even think we told you this. One time when he was over in Europe, he and his wife were going over to Europe, I think when they were going to Russia, his parents, Abigail and John, said, don't take your older sons with you. We're going to keep them here in Massachusetts and educate them here in Massachusetts. So they were separated for their sons for many years. And poor Louisa Catherine, it wasn't even her choice. Her mother-in-law and her husband told her she had to do it. So it was hard.
Yikes. All right. So Allie, you had a quick thing and then we're going to end.
see, I do.
What's
Two
up?
names. I won't be here tomorrow because the disappointment and thinking we're gonna draw. For
We're
tomorrow.
going to draw mandalas, but that's okay if you miss it. No worries. Have fun, whatever you're doing.
Yep.
All right. So
Everybody.
everybody,
Everybody.
thank you, Brian and Julie.
Tomorrow night.
We will see you next week.
See you at 7.
Tomorrow night,
All right. Big
Bye,
thanks.
everybody.
Yes, Jürgen?
All right, I'm gonna end the meeting.
Half
So
See you
say your
later.
quick goodbyes. Bye-bye.
Tomorrow,
Peace, half dog. Peace out, Mrs. Half dog.
You can text me the question.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I'll see you guys tonight.
All right, bye.
Have a coke, Brian.
Thanks,
Yeah, Ben.
guys.
Peace out, Brian.